Welcome, everybody. This is Netta Pitt. I'm the host of the CISOs Current, a CISOs Connect podcast. Today, I am lucky enough to have Sam Masiello, and he is going to join us, and we're going to talk about how the role has changed, how we are communicating risk, how we are effectively doing that. So, without further ado, I am going to introduce Sam and let him introduce yourself, and then we'll jump into it. So,
Great.
Sam, take it away.
Great. Thank you, Netta. So I'm Sam Masiello. I'm the enterprise CISO at the Anschutz Corporation. The Anschutz Corporation is effectively a private equity / holding company. We have properties or entities, wholly owned subsidiaries across many different verticals: sports and entertainment, hospitality, so sports teams, sports venues, festivals, resorts, hotels. We got this oil and gas properties as well. Sorry, can't talk this morning. We have oil and gas properties as well, online film, print, journalism, media, many nonprofits. So a very broad portfolio. So this is an important topic for me, just because the way we talk about risk from a board perspective, and even within the properties, is all just very different. Because when you think about the larger companies on one end of the portfolio that have lots of consumer data, lots of PII, lots of privacy related information, on one end of the spectrum, all the way down to we have a film group as well that has about 25 employees that doesn't have necessarily any PII except for employee data, which is of course important too. But they deal more with intellectual property and intellectual property risk and things like that on a regular basis. And so like the conversations I get to have with them about their programs and their risk is all very different. So in my role as the enterprise CISO is I have oversight over all of the security programs that are in the portfolio. They all have their own CIOs, they all have their own CISOs, so they all have an operational person on the ground every day that works with those companies from a day-to-day operational security perspective. But then I work with them more on strategy, direction of their programs, measurement of the maturity of their programs, things like that.
Just something small that you do on the side, right, Sam?
Yeah, that's right. That's right.
Just, something.
It's not busy. There's not a whole lot to do.
No, not at all. You're not changing hats at all.
Yeah.
So that's actually, great, like you were saying, because you really span the spectrum, right? From small to large to PII to PCI, the whole gamut, right? Intellectual property, the whole gamut. So this is great because you're always having to change how you present that information, not only to the other subsidiaries, right, that you're working with, but also up to the board, and how that looks across the organization and what the risk posture of the whole looks
Yep.
like, right?
Yep.
So when you are doing that, and I would take the and you can answer this as a two-part question, however you want to answer it.
Mhm.
But if you're looking at it from the point of view of your subsidiaries and how you're helping them and coaching them, how do you communicate cyber risk to the business,
Mhm.
who may not be completely, technical or as technical as us,
Mhm.
and understand all of that information? And what strategies do you bring to those conversations? And then on the other side, right? Because you're playing both sides of the fence, basically. How do you do that at the overall board level for your organization? So I'd love to understand that from you.
Yeah. So the most important thing, at least from my perspective, is to really, when we're working with our subsidiary companies, is to meet them where they are, right? Because it really is important to make sure that we're having conversations with them that are relevant to their specific business. Because the conversations I have with the film group, for example, with 20, 25 people, are very different than the conversations I have with the entertainment group that has all the PII, PCI data, right? All of that information. And not to say that others don't in the middle of that as well, but I'm just talking about kind of the extreme ends of the spectrum. And so it's really important, like I said, to meet them where they are from the standpoint of understanding the risks that they are dealing with on a regular basis, the types of problems and the threat profile that they have, that they exhibit across the internet, so that what potentially makes them a target, what potentially does not make them a target. But to with those conversations that we have with the individual subsidiary companies, it really is very personalized to what is specific to them and what's important to them. Because the things that hospitality cares about, again, is very different than the things that oil and gas cares about too, because you're talking about lots of OT in the oil and gas environment also, where that's a fairly unique thing throughout the at least our portfolio, is that we don't necessarily have OT everywhere, but we do need to make sure that we're having conversations about OT risk with the companies that have that part of their business. And so those conversations are really very personalized to those individual companies. And then what we've done from a wider enterprise perspective as it relates to helping measure program maturity and help measure risk within the programs, and then also communicate that up to the board, is we've created our own measurement frameworks. We basically took ISO 27001 and distilled that down into a much smaller set of controls that really are considered to be foundational across the entire portfolio. So whether you're the entertainment group, whether you're the film group, or somebody in between, it's a kind of foundational set of things that a security program should have in place. And it's all about access control, all the basic things that that every program should be doing. But again, meeting them where they are from the standpoint of not necessarily expecting that the film group would have things implemented to the same level that we would expect the entertainment group to be. So while we certainly evaluate everybody with the same questions, we don't necessarily expect them to do things the same way or to the same level as others. So how we've done that from a board reporting perspective is we've built different tiers into that model. So we've coupled that distilled down framework, what we call our enterprise security standard, combined it with CMMI to be able to give the properties an opportunity to be able to figure out from a self-assessment perspective where they measure themselves from a maturity standpoint. So we don't expect everybody to be a 5. We expect everybody to have some level of maturity, but at the same time, I gotta keep saying meeting them where they are, but I think that's kind of the most important aspect of kind of that, looking at risk without necessarily looking at it from the same level, right? The same playing field across the portfolio of companies. And so as we look at the individual companies, they self-assess themselves against this framework and against the CMMI to create their own maturity scores for each of those individual controls. So they rate themselves for each control. And then we use that as a measurement mechanism up to the board. And so I mentioned a moment ago about the tiering structure. So the companies that are on that kind of lower end of the risk profile as it relates to the entirety of the portfolio, we expect them to be at a certain level. We expect the companies that are at the higher end of the risk profile, the risk threshold, to be at the higher end of that maturity rating. So we use that as a mechanism to not only help the companies provide or understand rather where their risk is relative to their own programs, because the areas where they score lower are areas that they probably should look at improving. But then we also use that as a mechanism up to the board as well to say, this is where the properties are at from an overall maturity perspective. This is where we expect them to be based off of their overall risk. And then this is where they are tracking relative to those individual goals. And so it's a fairly complex program, but something that is built in such a way that it's managing the individual risks of the companies and not necessarily treating everybody like a peanut butter spread and expecting everybody to be the same when they don't need to be.
Right. No, that's a great way of looking at it. Because and using the CMMI, right, allows everybody to talk the same language,
Mhm.
right? And get to a point where, if I'm that, like you were saying, that company that's, the film company that's only 25, that doesn't have PII, doesn't have, except for, the employees, then my risk is different, right? And so my CMMI, again, like you were saying, I don't expect everybody to spend an X amount of dollars to get to a 5 when
That's
it's
right.
over, right? It should be, should I be at a 2? Should I be at a 3? Where is that range? And
Exactly.
being able to adjust that against, each individual company and roll up to the overall. This is holistically, if you look at our overall organization, this is where we are. And these are broken down by the tiers of what we expect someone, depending on where the company is and what information and risk level they have.
Yep.
So
And it's a great tool though from a roadmap perspective too. So not only do we use it as a measurement mechanism up to the board so they can see how well the maturity of the individual programs is progressing, it also shows the individual companies where their weak points are, where they should focus some energy as well. Because while some of the smaller companies may not necessarily have PII, they have other data that's important to them as well, right? Like the film group, they have movie screenplays that they're reviewing. They have contracts with movie houses that they wouldn't necessarily want to get out there. And so from an intellectual property perspective, they have data that's very important to them as well that they need to make sure they're protecting at the level that makes sense for them.
no, and that's exactly where I was headed next, right? Is how when you have those conversations, right, and they've done the same am I, then you have that roadmap.
Hmm.
Does that talk to me about how and the audience about how that helps to really hone in on the roadmap and what is, because inevitably cybersecurity is all about trade-offs, right?
Hmm.
We're trying to obviously generate profits. There's a cost to cybersecurity. What's the happy medium, right? Where's that like natural spot where they kind of meet, and you spend the right amount of money to protect what you need and ensure that you're driving profit, right, and driving the goals of the business. So when I would say that I would assume, and you can correct me if my assumption is wrong, but I would assume that in your companies that are on your smaller scale, right, and on your probably your first tier, right, um, it really helps them to be able to say, okay, we're going to have to figure out how to cover this particular thing, whether it's access, whether it's data, whatever it is. But we know we're falling a little bit behind on here. Here's how and what we need to do, and here's how we need to address it. I would say on the other side of it, on your larger, like say tier three, and I'm not even sure if that's how you tier them, but
Sure.
that's um, that would be more strategic goals, right? Because
Yeah.
you're driving, here's where we want to be by next year in doing X in your one of your entertainment or hospitality. We want to drive this program. That means we need to do, some new identity or some new uh, SaaS-based security of
Mhm.
some sort, right? This is what it's going to take for us to get and reach that goal. So it becomes much more strategic. They're strategic in the sense that they're moving the organization forward, but one is a little bit more tactical,
Yeah.
and I think the other one becomes a little bit more strategic in the overall planning towards company goals. So
Mhm.
can you talk to me about that in general, and how that's perceived and how that's embraced at the various different organizations?
Yeah, for sure. So, and that's kind of where my team comes in as well, helping to work with them on that strategy level of their program, right? Because the framework that we built, at least the measurement framework, is really, as I said, it's really intended to be foundational, right? It's not intended to be an aspirational goal, such that when you've achieved certain maturity targets of this framework that you think you're done with security, right? There's lots of conversations that have to happen around, to your point, like from the entertainment group side, global organization, many different geographies, many different networks, many different tech stacks that need to be centralized. But those conversations are very much more, as you said, strategic in nature around what are the things we need to be thinking around above and beyond the measurement framework of just the basic security of the organization. What are the things you need to be doing in order to protect the other data that you have out there, right? Because the tech stacks for some of the smaller companies, pretty simple, right? They might have everything in Microsoft, they might have everything in SharePoint, right? Their world is much more condensed than some of the more complex organizations that have a lot of SaaS sprawl, right? They have a lot of data all over the place and lots of different types of tools between the finance organization, between the marketing organization, between the HR organization, the IT organization. And so there's a lot of work that needs to be done to really kind of inventory a lot of that stuff so you know where your data is. And that's one of the things that we have started to push out from an enterprise perspective across our companies is what we call our enterprise initiatives. And those are things that, independent of the framework, are things that we want everybody to be strategically thinking about relative to their programs. And one of those things that we've implemented over the course of the next couple of years is cloud security. Cloud security meaning that getting a better feel for where that data is, what that data is, how do you need to protect that information, how how do you understand how that data is being used at some of the SaaS providers that you're doing business with? Because now they're all saying AI, right? They all say they use AI. They all say they
No
have
one's
AI.
using AI. Come on, Sam. No one. No one
Well,
at
that's
all.
right. Well, it's kind of like, to me, AI and like SPM, security posture management or just posture management, is what as a service was 20 years ago, 25 years ago. Where like everybody had to say 25 years ago that they were something as a service, whether it was software as a service, then infrastructure as a service came around, then platform as a service, and then everybody created their own as a service term because they all had to have their own. And so now I feel like SPM and AI are kind of the same thing, where everybody has to say there's some kind of SPM or some kind of PM. They're all using AI. And if you don't say that, even if it's not really actual AI, but you have to say you're using it, because if you don't, then people will wonder, like, well, why aren't you doing that? Because everybody else is.
Right.
So understanding how that data is being used at some of these third-party providers as well is a hugely important aspect of understanding what your security posture is as well, because if you don't understand where that data is, what that data is, and how they're using it, then you don't necessarily understand how that data or that information could potentially be used to create other products, and how that potentially is a risk to you as an organization. So strategically, that's where we, like I said, my team kind of comes in, is to help support some of the um, initiatives that our companies have as well around helping them understand better how to protect that information, right? Because at the end of the day, regardless of what sort of cloud security provider or strategy you have, it all comes down to the protection of the data. And regardless of what that data is, whether it's data that falls under privacy regulations, whether it's data that you just need to make sure you're protecting from a security standpoint, whether it's the screenplays and contracts that you're holding as an organization, whether it's the OT data that you're collecting around, off of sensors on oil rigs that are out in the field somewhere, right? All of that information is something that, from a strategic perspective, needs to be understood, not only from the standpoint of what it is, but where it is. And if you don't have the basic data elements down of the program and understood of the program, then you really don't necessarily have a good understanding as to where your crown jewels are and what you really need to protect.
Yeah, I mean, so that's that going back to the AI conversation, right? Because I think that's spot on, right? Is everybody's using AI, everybody's saying, "Hey, we have AI, really have ML, but whatever, we'll split hairs." But the part that I find that's interesting, I think, and I'd like to get your take on it, is I think everybody's running headlong into AI, right? And trying to create their own AI, create their own models, do that, right? Because it is a business differentiator.
Mhm.
100% agree.
Mhm.
However, going back to the conversation you were just having and talking about the data,
Mhm.
right? How many organizations do you feel, and since you have a lot of organizations under your purview, right, actually know where their data is, where it's being housed, how it's being used, and when it was last, manipulated,
Mhm.
right? I mean, because at the end of the day, it goes to some of the things about OT, right?
Mhm.
And when we were doing, when we started down the path of remote processing, right? You can't just set those and forget it like that commercial says, right? You have to go back and check,
Yep.
because if somebody's skimming off an extra half a penny,
Mhm.
right? Like they can go back in and change those things. It's the same thing with data, right? If you don't know where the data is and how it's being housed and how it's being managed and who is manipulating that data,
Mhm.
I think that you are somewhat suspect on the ML that you're creating
Mhm.
for that data.
Yeah.
What are your thoughts on that?
Yeah, I think that's to answer your original question on how many companies understand where their data is. I think they understand bits and pieces of it, but it's hard to get that entire organizational picture when you have people that are in other departments, for example, that they have a credit card that they can use that you can use to procure services, and they don't necessarily potentially even need IT to integrate those services into the wider organization. And so they don't involve IT, which means from a third party risk perspective, but from a security team standpoint, you have no visibility into the fact that vendor is even part of the organization. You have no visibility into what data is potentially being uploaded into that tool or being manipulated by that tool. You have no idea what the risks are associated with that third party as well. And so it creates a dangerous environment, right? Or at least from
It's
the
perfect, basically. That's what you're saying. It's a perfect setup.
yeah,
Like you don't have to do anything or worry about it because everybody's controlled that data, right? And
right.
that like when they, I know that's the scary part of when you start to think about everybody swiping their credit card and in, involving services. You're like,
Yep. Yep.
did anybody think of any of those things that you just went through?
And you like to think, maybe within your organization, hopefully you think you have strong procurement processes that would, make sure the right people got looped into those sorts of things. But that's not always the case. And as your organization gets bigger and more complex, that gets harder and harder to be able to rein in. And so I think people understand again where the data that lives on the systems that they know about, but it's to quote Donald Rumsfeld, the unknown unknowns that become the real risk, right? Because you have all these other systems that people have procured on their own that likely have data in them that you have no idea about, and all the things we just talked about a moment ago.
Yeah, I mean that's one of the key areas that's I think is funny and is one of the newer areas you're talking about posture management, but I think it's that SaaS security posture management, right? Because everybody's just swiping their credit card,
Mm-hmm.
right? And hey, I want Monday, hey, I want this, I want that, right? And because it's the new great thing and it's something they used at another company or it's they're trying to get their job done,
Exactly.
right?
Yes.
And so I don't fault anybody for doing that,
Mm-hmm.
but the challenge is you set it up. I mean, there's a couple of challenges just on that the SaaS security posture, right? People just set it up and they set it up with the standard, protocols, right?
Mm-hmm.
Security protocols. Those protocols don't actually match 9 times out of 10
Mm-hmm.
your organization's protocols, right?
Yep.
So you automatically have something that isn't as secure as it should be within
Mm-hmm.
your environment.
Mm-hmm.
Then secondly is you have everybody going and getting that free application,
Mm-hmm.
right? And then you've done that 10 times over. And if you start to have a conversation with your legal team, they're kind of scared about it as well because then it's did we violate a EULA,
Mm-hmm.
right? Because
Yep.
and then that's going to be a problem, right? Because after so many people in an organization have it, you have to go to an enterprise license.
Mm-hmm.
So, but that's that part where it's about process. To me, I think it's about process.
Mm-hmm.
And so talk to me about how when you bring up these concerns, right, to the business and you say, "Hey, it's really about process. We just need to fine tune our process." What is the reaction that you're getting from the organization? How do you feel that they're embracing that? And how do you tackle when they potentially are not essentially on the same page as you?
Yeah, it's hard, right? I mean, it's because within the organizations, they do their best to try to set the standard. They do their best to try to set the policy. But as you know, people, like you said, and you're exactly right when you said people just want to get their job done, right? They want to be more effective at their job. They want to be more efficient at their job, and sometimes they feel not involving the IT and security organizations is a path to do that. And then you end up with another risk, right? That comes adjacent to the things you were just mentioning a moment ago of people swiping their credit card, they do their thing, they buy these services, they upload their data, they start doing whatever they're going to do, and then their focus changes and they start doing something else, and now there's this tool that still has their data in it that they never go back to potentially, or they leave the company and nobody knows that they bought this thing and we're using this thing, and now the data is still sitting out there not being managed or used, or to your point earlier on the configuration of the environment, nobody's caring or feeding that thing either to make sure that it's actually being done in the right way. And so how we address it it, it's hard. Like I said, it's something where like you have the processes in place within an organization to set up how services are procured, and I would say that some companies are a bit tighter on that than others. But I said it a couple of times, but when your organization gets bigger and more complex, sometimes making sure that standard is followed is the hardest part, and making sure that even if you have top down support to make sure that those processes are going to be followed, again, you have people on a day-to-day basis who are just trying to make sure that they can do their job and do it more effectively. And so they'll go outside a process to be able to do what they think is the right thing or what they hope is the right thing, but don't necessarily understand. And this is where it really gets difficult, right? The awareness of understanding what the potential risk is of what they're trying to do. And we've actually done some tabletop exercises across our properties on that too, to help them understand where the gaps potentially are in their procurement process, where those sorts of things can potentially happen, and some of the risks that are associated with it. So one that we did last year was one where we had an employee that was very well intentioned, right? Same thing we're talking about now. They went out and procured a third party service that was going to be able to help them take all their data. We didn't necessarily specify a particular function, but take all their data, be able to process it in a way that was going to be able to provide them dashboards and reports and make their lives a lot more efficient and easy, and take 20 hours worth of work that they were doing before and be able to do it in 30 minutes, right? Who doesn't want that? Who doesn't want to be able to do 20 hours of work in 30 minutes?
Right.
And so, but when they did this, they had their own card that they were able to use, their own company purchase card, because they didn't need IT to get the data that they work with on a regular basis. They just started doing their thing, only to find out that, to your point earlier, the environment was set up in an insecure way. Somebody was able to get into the system, steal the data. And so there's a whole conversation around process, right? And what the HR processes around are around employees who are not following proper procurement processes. The fact that this did end up being an incident for the organization because there was PII that was uploaded into that tool that ended up getting compromised. There was the process around TPRM and how to better close some loops around that. So it's a very timely question, just because we did a tabletop with all of our subsidiaries just around that issue, because we wanted to poke holes in and find potential holes in procurement process or communication or policy or how those things would be enforced, and all of that put together, because there's a lot of different teams that need to be involved in those discussions, right? This is not just an IT discussion. This is not a security discussion. This is a business discussion and a business risk that companies need to be more aware of, because it not only can happen, it is happening.
Right. Well, and to that point, right? I mean, we earlier in the conversation we talked about everybody saying they're using AI, right?
Mm-hmm.
But then what are they using AI in the background? Like, I don't want something as, open, in the Chinese government, right, to be having all of my data, right? So that's one of the things that, like, you need to understand, and that's that third party risk management that you're talking about. That's a conversation that security, I don't ever expect marketing to know those questions to ask, right? And that's where, and I really hope that marketing never expects me to understand how to put a marketing plan together, right? Because that's not what I do.
Yeah.
We all have our specialty. Working together, we can close any of the gaps in between. And I think, what you've been saying over the past, during this conversation is, it's really inevitable, and not inevitable, it's really important to drive relationships and drive that trust within the various different organizations across your whatever company you're in, right? Because, and how diverse those different business units are doesn't matter. Every one of those have to come through and touch security in some way.
Yes.
Right. If they're using data, if they're trying to get their work done, if they're working for the company, they're interacting with something that is of cybersecurity importance. And so, talk to me how this last conversation, this last question, as we wrap up, tell me how you think, and where, when you first started, those relationships were, right? Where they are now, and where do you think the importance of those relationships are going, and how does the business see that?
Yeah, that's a great question. And I will say, and I think this is kind of related to the question. So one of the things that I'll just touch on a little pet peeve of mine for a moment, because you kind of touched on it with your previous comment. I hate the term IT security. I don't know why people call the security team IT security, because what that basically lends itself for the business to believe is that security serves the needs of the IT organization. And so that in and of itself, I think just the vernacular of saying things like IT security puts up barriers that exist between security and the rest of the business. Not to say that we as leaders shouldn't be able to overcome those barriers, but I think it does put a thought in people's minds that if I don't need IT, then I don't need security. And so that's something that I try to mention whenever I possibly can, because I think it's an important distinction to make between functions that exist for IT and things that exist for the business. And security is definitely a function that needs to your point earlier, reach out across the business and have those relationships and have that trust across the business. Because if you don't have that, then you're not going to succeed in your role, or you'll be a great service for IT, but not necessarily serving the rest of the business. So anyway, just wanted to kind of mention that, because that's something that I think is adjacent to this discussion, but is something that I think is an important, at least to me, distinction that security leaders need to make sure that they're getting through and establishing those relationships as a business leader, not as a technology leader. But as we reach out across the businesses, having those conversations around risk and how we communicate that to our individual stakeholders within the business, to me, is an important part of our, as I mentioned earlier, part of our success. And if we're not having those conversations across marketing and across legal and across HR and across finance and with the executives, right? I mean, the tone always has to start at the top. If you don't have the support from the top of your executive food chain, if you will, then the feeling across the business is always going to be, well, if I don't have my business leaders telling me that these things are important, then I'm not going to feel that they are important. And so having those relationships start at the top, and having that trust built at the top, and having them understand what your vision is, right? Have a plan, have a roadmap, have a strategy, have something you can communicate to the business and help them understand what your North Star is, right? What are you trying to get to as a business, and make sure you align together what is important. Because from a security leader's perspective, there are a million things we could be doing, but how many of those things are actually important to the business? How many of those things are actually important to the CEO? How many of those things are actually important to what the goals of the business are? So if you're not having discussions around, to your question earlier, business goals and strategy around the business, you need to be having those discussions, because otherwise what you think is important, or what you might think be the things you need to focus on, are not the things that are important to the business. And when something happens that violates the integrity or the availability or the confidentiality of the data that the business cares about, you find yourself, unfortunately, on the wrong end of a one-way conversation. So have those alignment discussions individually with your business leaders, and understand what's important to them, to understand what needs to be important to you, and then build your roadmap and build your strategy based off of that.
Now, I mean, Sam, you've touched on so many key points, and this has been a great conversation. I really thank you. I think our role doesn't ever get easier, right? Our role continues to become much more complex.
Sure.
And I think being able to share points of view like this in these types of conversation is super helpful to the CISO organization as a whole, right? I mean, my favorite saying is, this is a team sport and we're all in it together, right? And so where we can share and see those different perspectives is helpful to everybody in that's doing this role and that is trying to protect our organizations. So I thank you so much for joining me, and hopefully we'll be able to have you back at some point in time. And again, thank you so much. Any final parting words?
No, just thank you for your time today. Thanks for the opportunity, and absolutely look forward to being able to do this again at some point in the future.
Awesome. Thank you, everybody, for joining us today on the CISOs Connect Current, a CISOs Connect podcast. I look forward to seeing you on our next episode. Thank you.